Once upon a time, there was an upper-class family who lived a very extravagant life. The husband, Sam, was a lawyer who had plenty of work because the neighboring communities were very litigious. Because of all the work that he did, arguing for the transfer of assets from defendants' accounts into plaintiffs' accounts, he felt entitled to live life to the fullest. He lived in a huge house, drove the finest cars, had a full contingent of housekeepers and landscapers, and threw parties where he would have very high-end liquors and exotic foods served. He even insisted that his wife, Melissa, not work, lest people get the impression that the family needed a second income. Their son, Charles, was a popular kid in school, partly because he drove a nice car, but also because he had the latest in electronic gadgets, which for some reason or other was a status symbol among the other kids at school. One evening, at one of their extravagant parties, Sam overheard a conversation between some of the other parents and his wife, Melissa. They were discussing college funding and where the kids would be going to school. Sam walked over because he wanted to be sure that the other parents knew that Charles would be going to Harvard. The other parents lamented that they could never afford to send their kids to such a school without burdening the kids with crushing debt. Sam immediately started offering advice. He suggested that they do what he did and put something aside for this large future expense. When asked about his approach, Sam replied that he had set up a fund. Every month, he would add to that fund. He explained that he only invested in the safest of investments, but rest assured, the funds grew due to the interest paid. The other parents were intrigued by the idea, but wondered how they would be able to replicate what Sam was able to accomplish. The party that night ended, and the parents went home. Month after month, and party after party passed by. Then the day came when it was time to make the first payment to Harvard. Melissa and Charles, who never themselves took an interest in the family finances, were excited for the day that Charles would start school. Sam drove them both to the university, where their first stop was the bursar's office. Sam approached the clerk and drew out an impressive-looking logbook and handed it to the clerk. The clerk stared at it for a few moments and then asked Sam what he wanted done with this logbook. Sam looked a little taken aback for a moment and said to the clerk, "Transfer these assets from my son's college trust fund into the name of the university." "Sir," said the clerk, "all I see are ledger entries with a memo next to them saying I owe you X number of dollars." "What's wrong with that?" said Sam. "Look at my clothes. Look at what I drive. Can't you see I'm good for it? These IOUs are backed by the full faith and credit of my family." Needless to say, Charles went to community college that year instead of Harvard. He would have liked for his dad to have borrowed the money for him to go to Harvard, but as he learned later, his dad's extravagant lifestyle caused the family to build up so much debt that nobody was interested in extending additional credit. If you watched the video I put out a few days ago, you probably had already figured out where I was going with this story of successful Sam and his lavish lifestyle. I presented this chart in that video that broke down the sources of government spending by year. It included individual and corporate income tax, explicit borrowing, and Social Security and disability taxes, which I later called implicit borrowing. The reason I called the social insurance taxes implicit borrowing was because the taxes collected were more than sufficient to pay current benefits to retirees and the disabled, but the taxes were spent on other items and replaced with treasury bonds. The treasury bonds are considered assets held in a trust fund. Much like Sam's account that merely contained IOUs, the Social Security Trust Fund contains obligations of the Treasury. They can't be used to pay for current benefits unless someone steps up to the plate and offers cash in exchange for them. It is the cash that is spendable and not the bonds. Thus, social insurance has really been more of a borrowing scheme than a pay-as-you-go system, as advertised. Let's take a look at the size of the Social Security Old Age Survivors and Disability Insurance Trust Fund. This data comes directly from the Social Security Administration's webpage. There are a few features that I'd like to point out. The first is the point in time when the trust fund started to grow significantly, which was in the mid-1980s. Not many people know this, but in 1981, President Reagan created a National Commission on Social Security Reform and appointed Alan Greenspan, who was not yet Federal Reserve Chairman, to chair the committee. The report the Commission issued in 1983 became the basis for that year's changes in Social Security law, which greatly increased Social Security taxes. Because the taxes collected were more than enough to cover current benefits, it enabled the government to spend the money on other things and grow what appeared to be a separate account to pay out future obligations which were known to be much larger. You and I know that the fund merely contained Sam's IOUs. It should also be noted that Bill Clinton's widely touted budget surplus in 1998 was largely due to the excess tax collections for Social Security. When combined with a booming stock market that year, it resulted in a public debt that did not increase. Voila, a balanced budget. But if we take a look at this chart, we can see that contrary to popular belief, the obligations of the government were not really stagnant that year. They were growing. Now, the last thing that I'd like to point out is that the trust fund is no longer growing. This is a very important thing to note because Social Security taxes are a source of current funding for not only paying out obligations to current recipients, but also for paying out other government spending. From 1990 to the year 2000, the trust fund increased more than fourfold at an annual rate of increase of 17%. From 2000 to 2010, the fund increased only 2.5-fold, or an annual rate of 10%. In the years 2010 to 2015, the fund grew by less than 0.5% per year. This slowing rate of growth highlights the impact of our aging population. As more and more people start collecting benefits, it causes fewer funds to be available for paying out other lavish government spending. We are now at a point where slightly more is coming out of the trust fund every year than going in. The Social Security Administration reports that the trust fund will be depleted within 2 decades. But I don't think that that's our primary problem. Our problem is that our Harvard bursar is not accepting Sam's IOUs as a payment.